Somewhere in the highlands of northwestern Greece, in the autumn of 480 BC, the most powerful army the ancient world had ever assembled ground to a halt. It had crossed continents. It had bridged the Hellespont with a floating road of boats lashed together across more than a mile of open sea. It had marched through Thrace, through Macedonia, through Thessaly, consuming the resources of entire kingdoms just to keep itself fed and moving. Its king, Xerxes of Persia, had watched from a golden throne as his navy smashed into the Greek fleet at Artemisium. He had reduced the sacred city of Athens to ash and rubble. Every Greek polis that had dared resist him had been either destroyed or forced into humiliating submission. And yet here, at a narrow mountain pass above a small coastal town, the advance of this empire-devouring force had been held for 3 full days by a force so small it barely constituted a garrison. That force was now dead. Every last man of the Greek rearguard had been killed. And the man who had commanded them, a Spartan king named Leonidas, lay somewhere among the bodies on that blood-soaked ground. But the story of what happened at Thermopylae is not simply the story of those 3 days. It is the story of a trap, a strategic, political, and psychological trap that the Greeks had been constructing for years before that battle ever began. A trap that would ultimately consume not just an army, but an empire's ambitions. And the extraordinary thing is that the greatest military mind in the Persian order of battle may have seen it coming. He warned Xerxes about it directly. Xerxes ignored him. His name was Demaratus, and he had once been a king of Sparta. To understand how a small collection of Greek city-states, perpetually at war with one another, economically modest by Persian standards, divided by dialect, culture, and centuries of tribal rivalry, managed to defeat the largest military operation the ancient world had witnessed up to that point, you have to go back roughly a decade to the first Persian attempt on Greece. You have to go back to Marathon. In 490 BC, Darius I of Persia sent a naval expedition across the Aegean with somewhere between 15 and 30,000 soldiers. The precise numbers remain debated by historians, but the force was substantial. Its target was Athens, which had made the catastrophic diplomatic error, from a Persian perspective, of sending warships to support an Ionian Greek revolt against Persian rule. For Darius, this was not a matter of strategy. It was a matter of imperial honor. The Greeks would be punished. What happened instead was one of the most consequential upsets in military history. The Athenian army, reinforced by a contingent from the small city of Plataea, met the Persians on the coastal plain of Marathon and destroyed them. The Persian cavalry, which should have been devastating against the Greek heavy infantry, appears to have been either absent from the field at the crucial moment or unable to engage effectively on the terrain the Athenians had chosen. The Greeks used a thinned center and strengthened wings to envelop the Persian flanks, driving them back into the sea in a rout that killed thousands. Athens had done something almost no one in the Greek world thought possible. It had looked the Persian Empire in the face and made it blink. Darius died before he could retaliate. His son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the grudge, and Xerxes, unlike his father, decided that the next expedition against Greece would not be a punitive raid. It would be a conquest, total, permanent, and overwhelming. The preparation took years. Persian engineers bridged the Hellespont twice because a storm destroyed the first crossing, and Xerxes, in an act of theatrical rage that became famous in antiquity, reportedly ordered the waters to be whipped with chains as punishment. A canal was cut through the Athos Peninsula, sparing the fleet the dangerous rounding of a cape that had destroyed a previous Persian armada. Supply depots were established along the march route through northern Greece. The logistical infrastructure assembled for this invasion was, by any ancient standard, extraordinary. If you find this kind of deep historical storytelling compelling, consider subscribing to the Lost Testament. We cover the moments history almost forgot to preserve. The Greek response to this enormous gathering of force was shaped by two realities that are easy to overlook from a modern vantage point. The first was political. Greece was not a nation, It was a fractious collection of hundreds of independent city-states, each with its own government, its own army, its own foreign policy, and its own complex web of alliances and enmities. Many of them, particularly in the north, chose what the Greeks called Medism, accommodation with Persia. Thessaly, one of the most powerful regions in northern Greece, submitted. So did several others. The coalition that ultimately resisted Xerxes was smaller than it might appear in popular memory, dominated by Athens and Sparta, and a coalition of perhaps 30-odd states who gathered at the Isthmus of Corinth in 481 BC and agreed, for the first time in their fractious history, to stop fighting each other long enough to fight Persia. The second reality was geographical. Greece is a country of mountains, narrow coastal corridors, choke points, and island-dotted seas. Any invading army moving south through the Greek peninsula had to pass through places where its numerical advantage became almost irrelevant. The Greeks understood this. Their entire strategic plan was built around it. The first line of that plan was Thermopylae. The pass itself is far narrower than most people imagine. In 480 BC, before centuries of silt deposition widened the shoreline, the passage between the cliffs and the sea was, at its tightest point, wide enough for perhaps a single cart. The Greek word Thermopylae means hot gates, a reference to the sulfurous hot springs that bubbled at the site. It was here that the Greek alliance sent an advance force under the Spartan king Leonidas, with orders to hold the pass while the main armies mobilized, and the Athenian fleet engaged the Persian navy at Artemisium, just off the coast to the north. The force Leonidas commanded was small, 300 Spartans along with several thousand allied Greeks from Theope, Corinth, Arcadia, and other states. The small number of Spartans has sometimes been attributed to the fact that a major religious festival, the Carneia, restricted Spartan military movement, and that the main Spartan army was intended to follow. Historians debate how much of this was genuine religious observance and how much was political hedging by a Spartan government not fully committed to a forward defense. What is not debated is the terrain's logic. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans could hold a line as effectively as 30,000. The pass made numbers almost meaningless. What followed over 3 days in late August or early September of 480 BC has entered the permanent vocabulary of military history. The Persians attacked repeatedly. Each time the Greek heavy infantry, hoplites, armored in bronze, fighting in a tight interlocking formation called a phalanx, ground the assault to pieces. Persian troops, many of them lightly armed infantry or archers more suited to open field warfare, were funneled into a killing ground where their numbers conferred no advantage. Xerxes reportedly sent wave after wave of soldiers forward. The ground became impassable with bodies. The elite Persian infantry, the immortals, were thrown into the assault and were stopped like everyone else. Then a local Greek man, whose name Herodotus records as Ephialtes, approached the Persian camp. He offered to show Xerxes a mountain path, the Anopaia Trail, that curved around the pass and emerged behind the Greek position. Leave a comment below. When you heard about Ephialtes for the first time, did you already know how this story ended? I'd genuinely like to know. Xerxes accepted immediately. He sent the immortals up the mountain path by night. By morning, a Greek force of Phocians stationed to guard the path had scattered in the face of the Persian advance. Word reached Leonidas at dawn. The trap had been sprung, but not the one the Greeks had set. Leonidas held a council. Most of the allied Greeks withdrew, either by order or by choice. The Spartans stayed. So did the 700 Thespians, who refused to abandon the pass because their home city of Thespiae lay directly in the Persian path of march, and they had nowhere meaningful to retreat to. A force of 400 Thebans was also present, though their motivations and loyalty were disputed even in antiquity. What followed in the final hours of the battle belongs to that category of historical events so extreme they have resisted fictional embellishment for 2.5 millennia. The Spartans advanced from behind their defensive wall into the open ground before the pass, fighting until their spears broke, and then drawing swords and fighting further still until Leonidas himself was killed. The struggle over his body was savage. According to Herodotus, 4 times the Persians drove back the Greeks, and 4 times the Spartans recovered the corpse of their king. When the Persian force descending from the mountain path finally closed the encirclement, the survivors, however many remained standing at that point, made their last stand on a low hill. They were killed by Persian arrows. Xerxes subsequently ordered Leonidas's head cut from his body and placed on a stake, an act so extraordinary that Herodotus notes Xerxes had great anger toward Leonidas, even in death, which was widely considered a violation of the Persian king's customary respect for brave enemies. It suggests the 3 days at Thermopylae had cost something far greater than the Persians had expected to pay. But here is what conventional tellings of Thermopylae almost universally fail to explain. The battle was a Persian tactical victory. The pass was taken. The road south was open. Athens fell. The Acropolis was burned. By any conventional measure of military success, Xerxes had won. He had also walked directly into the second half of the trap. The Greek strategic plan had never depended on holding Thermopylae indefinitely. It had depended on buying time. Time for the Athenian fleet to engage and to trick the Persian navy at Artemisium. And more critically, time to prepare the real killing ground. The Athenian statesman Themistocles had read, years earlier, a peculiar oracle from Delphi that spoke of a wooden wall being the salvation of Athens. Where other Athenians interpreted this as a reference to the wooden palisade on the Acropolis, Themistocles argued it meant the fleet. He had spent years, persuading the Athenians to use a silver strike at the Laurian mines, not to distribute the wealth as dividend payments among the citizens, as was customary, but to build 200 warships, 200 triremes, the finest warships in the Greek world. If you appreciate history told the way it actually happened, no myths, no embellishment, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach the people who care about the truth. The Persian fleet, for all its numerical superiority, ancient sources give figures ranging from 600 to over 1,000 warships, though modern historians are considerably more skeptical of the higher numbers, faced a structural problem that had nothing to do with Greek courage. It was a logistics problem. It was a weather problem. It was a geography problem. Persian warships were not designed to operate in the narrow, island-choked, storm-prone waters of the Aegean, the way Greek ships were. During the march south, storms had already destroyed significant portions of the Persian fleet off the coast of Magnesia, and again off Euboea. The fleet was smaller and more exhausted than it had been at the start of the campaign, and Themistocles had identified a specific piece of water where the remaining Persian numerical advantage would become a liability rather than an asset: the Strait of Salamis. Between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland, the channel narrows dramatically. In that confined space, a large fleet could not maneuver. Ships would foul each other's oars. The famous Persian practice of using their numerical superiority to envelop and overwhelm an enemy fleet, wrapping around the flanks and attacking from multiple directions, would be physically impossible. In a narrow channel, what mattered was not how many ships you had, but how well your lead ships could fight. And Greek triremes, lower, faster, crewed by experienced Athenian rowers who had trained specifically for ramming tactics in confined water, were built precisely for that kind of engagement. Getting the Persians into the strait was the problem. Themistocles solved it with a deception so audacious that Herodotus could barely bring himself to describe it without a note of astonishment. He sent a personal slave, a man named Sisinus, secretly to the Persian fleet command with a message. The message claimed, in Themistocles' own name, that the Greek fleet was demoralized, divided, and planning to escape under cover of darkness. If the Persians moved quickly, they could trap and destroy the Greek ships before dawn. Themistocles, the message implied, was secretly sympathetic to Persia and was giving them this intelligence as a private betrayal of his own alliance. It was entirely fabricated. The Persian admirals, facing the pressure of a campaign that needed a decisive naval victory before the sailing season ended and the supply situation became critical, moved their fleet into blocking positions at both ends of the Salamis Strait during the night. Their crews rode through the darkness to seal the Greek escape routes the Greeks had no intention of using. By dawn on a morning in late September 480 BC, the Persian fleet was crowded into confined water, its crews tired from a night of rowing, its formations compressed and disordered. The Greek fleet, rested and ready, came out of the strait in tight formation. The battle that followed was one of the decisive engagements in Western history, and its outcome had been determined not by what happened that morning, but by the years of preparation, the strategic patience, the deception, and the calculated choice of terrain that preceded it. Persian ships, unable to maneuver, collided with each other. Triremes rammed and were rammed in water so crowded that disabled vessels could not be withdrawn. Greek ships operated in coordination, rotating tired crews back and fresh ships forward in a way the disordered Persian fleet could not match. The Persian rowers, many of them pressed levies from subject peoples who had their own complicated relationship with the empire they were fighting for, began to lose cohesion. By the time the sun was high, the Persian fleet was in full retreat. Xerxes watched from a throne set on a hillside overlooking the strait. He had come to observe a triumph. He watched a catastrophe instead. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Viewers of the Lost Testament come from every corner of the world, and every one of those perspectives on this history matters. The destruction of Persian naval power at Salamis did not end the campaign immediately, but it fundamentally altered the strategic situation. Without a functioning fleet, Xerxes could not keep his enormous land army supplied through the winter. The logistics of feeding and maintaining hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the precise numbers remain contested, but the force was massive enough to strain the agricultural capacity of the regions it passed through, required reliable sea lanes. Those sea lanes were now controlled by the Greeks. Xerxes withdrew north with a significant portion of his army, leaving a substantial force under his most capable general, Mardonius, to winter in Thessaly and continue the campaign in the spring. Mardonius was a sophisticated commander and a shrewd political operator. He spent the winter attempting to detach Athens from the Greek coalition through diplomatic offers, autonomy, reconstruction of the burned city, a privileged place in a Persian-aligned Greece. The Athenians refused. The Spartans, watching anxiously to see whether Athens might negotiate a separate peace, sent envoys of their own to Athens to reinforce the alliance. The diplomatic maneuvering of that winter was every bit as consequential as any battle. When Mardonius moved south in the spring of 479 BC, he occupied Athens again. He burned whatever the previous occupation had left standing, and then he withdrew north into Boeotia, to a position near the city of Plataea, where the terrain favored his cavalry, and where he could draw the Greek army onto ground of his choosing. What happened at Plataea in the summer of 479 BC is considerably less celebrated than Thermopylae or Salamis, but it was the battle that actually ended the Persian invasion. The Greek allied army that gathered at the foot of Mount Cithaeron numbered around 100,000 men, the largest Greek force ever assembled in the classical period. Mardonius commanded perhaps 70 to 80,000, including a substantial cavalry force and the elite Persian infantry. What followed was not a climactic single-day engagement. It was 11 days of maneuver, counter-maneuver, supply disruption, and grinding attrition, punctuated by moments of acute danger for both sides. Mardonius used his cavalry effectively to harass Greek supply lines and cut off a key spring that provided the allied army with water. The Greeks were forced to attempt a night withdrawal to a better position, a movement that became disordered and left their forces dangerously separated in the pre-dawn darkness. Mardonius, seeing what he believed was the Greek army in retreat and disorder, advanced across the open ground to finish them. It was the decisive mistake. The Spartans on the right wing stopped, turned, and formed their line. Mardonius led his cavalry and infantry directly into the most formidable infantry force in the Greek world, on ground that neutralized the Persian cavalry and gave every advantage to the Spartan phalanx. In the fighting that followed, Mardonius was killed. Sources suggest he was struck down in the press of battle near the Spartan line. With his death, Persian cohesion shattered. The battle became a rout and then a massacre, as tens of thousands of Persian soldiers fled toward their fortified camp and were systematically killed. On the same day, according to the tradition preserved by both Herodotus and later sources, though modern historians note the synchronicity may be literary rather than literal, the Greek fleet destroyed the remaining Persian naval forces at Cape Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. It was the end, not just of this campaign, but of any serious Persian attempt to conquer mainland Greece. Xerxes never returned. the empire redirected its resources, its attention, and its ambitions. The genius trap that the title of this documentary describes was not a single clever stratagem. It was a system, a layered, multi-year strategic architecture constructed by a group of leaders who understood their own limitations with extraordinary clarity. They knew they could not beat Persia in open-field battle at full scale. They knew they could not match Persian logistics or Persian manpower. So they built a strategy around what they did have: choke points, a fleet, time, and the willingness to sacrifice the defensible for the strategically sound. They gave up northern Greece. They gave up Attica. They burned their own city's resources and evacuated their own civilian population to deny them to the enemy. And at every stage, they channeled the Persian advance into environments that stripped away Persian advantages and amplified Greek ones. Themistocles, who deserves more of the credit for this architecture than history has customarily given him, he was ostracized from Athens within a decade of Salamis, a fact that still strikes historians as one of antiquity's grimmer ironies, understood something about the relationship between deception and strategy that would not be formally articulated in military theory for another 2,000 years. He understood that a trap is not only a physical thing, it is a cognitive one. The enemy must believe he is winning. The enemy must make choices that feel, to him, like the choices of a man in control of events. Xerxes moved his fleet into the Salamis Strait because he believed he was seizing an opportunity. He was walking through a door that had been built specifically for him. Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king who rode with the Persian court and had tried to warn Xerxes about Spartan resolve at Thermopylae, embodies the tragic dimension of this story. He had told Xerxes, according to Herodotus, that the Spartans would fight regardless of odds, because their law commanded it, and that no individual Spartan could retreat without dishonor, even when facing an army of 10,000. Xerxes had laughed. The idea that men would fight and die not from compulsion, but from cultural obligation, seemed absurd to a king who commanded by absolute authority. He fundamentally misread the nature of the enemy he faced, and that misreading shaped every decision that followed. This is why historians have continued to find the Persian Wars endlessly compelling. The Greek victory was not a miracle. It was the product of strategic thinking, institutional preparation, geographic intelligence, and a form of cultural stubbornness. The Spartan refusal to yield, the Athenian willingness to abandon their city rather than their strategy. That proved, in this particular contest, more powerful than the most sophisticated imperial military machine the ancient world had yet produced. The consequences rippled forward for centuries. A Persian conquest of Greece would have ended, or at minimum permanently stunted, the Athenian experiment in democratic governance that was just beginning to find its form in 480 BC. It would have eliminated or absorbed the philosophical and theatrical and scientific traditions that were emerging in Athens in precisely this period. History is not inevitably determined by single battles. The counterfactual question of what a Persian Greece might have produced is one historians approach with appropriate caution. But the survival of Athens in the decade after Salamis created the conditions for the extraordinary half-century of intellectual and artistic achievement that we now call the Golden Age of Athens. Sophocles, Euripides, Socrates, Herodotus himself, all of them lived and worked in the shadow of this victory, and many of them remembered it. The Greek commanders who designed this trap, Themistocles above all, but also Leonidas, whose decision to stay at Thermopylae with the rear guard bought the days that allowed the naval strategy to mature, and Pausanias, the Spartan regent who commanded at Plataea with a tactical patience that belied the image of Spartan brute force, were not simply brave. They were strategically creative in ways that their own cultures did not always recognize or reward. Themistocles died in Persian exile. Pausanias died under accusation of treason in a sealed chamber in Sparta. The men who saved Greece were consumed by the very political forces their victory had preserved. That, perhaps, is the most human detail in the whole extraordinary story. The genius that defeated history's greatest military minds was real and documented and specific, and the civilization it saved was not, in the end, particularly grateful to the people who made it possible. History has corrected that accounting over time, but the correction came too late for the men themselves. If the history you just heard is the kind you want more of, accurate, cinematic, and told without myth or embellishment, subscribe to The Lost Testament. Every video we produce is built from primary sources and honest scholarship, and there is a great deal more of this history left to tell.